I tried to warn them, standing there in my old rubber boots, sinking ankle-deep into the wet mud of the tidal flats. I told the HOA board exactly what would happen if they built there. I explained how the land breathed with the ocean, how it disappeared twice a day under the tide, how it had done so long before any of us were born. They smiled at me like I was a crazy old man. And then they paved it. The tidal flats stretched along the coast like a living organism. At low tide, they shimmered with shallow pools reflecting the sky, tiny crabs scuttling for cover, birds stabbing their beaks into the mud. At high tide, they vanished completely beneath the sea, as if they had never existed at all. That land didn't belong to anyone. Not legally. Not naturally. But the HOA thought money could change that. The letter arrived on thick, glossy paper. We are proud to announce the future home of Seabreeze Cove, a luxury coastal resort experience. I laughed when I read it. Then I felt sick. The plans showed infinity pools, private villas, glass front balconies, all sitting directly on top of the tidal flats. The very place marine biologists used to study coastal resilience. The same land environmental agencies had marked as "Do Not Develop." At the bottom of the page was a smiling signature from the HOA president, Martin Kessler, a man who had never once watched the tide come in. The HOA meeting was packed. Investors, homeowners, real estate agents. Everyone smelled profit. When it was my turn to speak, the room grew quiet, not because they respected me, but because they were waiting to dismiss me. "You build there," I said calmly, "and the ocean will take it back." Martin leaned back in his chair. "Sir, we've hired the best engineers money can buy." I pointed toward the window where the tide was already creeping in. "Engineering doesn't scare the sea." Someone laughed. Another person muttered, "He's just bitter." The vote passed unanimously. Construction began 2 weeks later. I watched excavators tear into the flats like predators. They drove deep concrete pylons into land that was never meant to be still. The mud bled water. Birds vanished. The tide behaved strangely, pooling where it never had before. Environmental complaints were filed. Permits were adjusted. Fines were paid, and quietly ignored. By the end of the year, Seabreeze Cove stood like a glass palace against the shoreline. And everyone praised the HOA for their vision. Cracks appeared before the grand opening. Hairline fractures in the lobby floor. Doors that wouldn't close properly. Elevators that jammed during high tide. The maintenance crews blamed settling. I knew better. The land wasn't settling. It was moving. Then came the forecasts. I sent emails. I made calls. I even showed up at the resort. They ignored me. The opening weekend was fully booked. Champagne flowed as the tide rose. The ocean didn't roar. It whispered. Water seeped beneath doors. Salt flooded the underground parking. Guests complained about the smell, that sharp, metallic scent of the sea reclaiming space. By midnight, the power flickered. The pools overflowed, not outward, but inward, merging with the rising tide. Concrete groaned. Someone screamed when a balcony railing snapped free and vanished into the dark water below. And that's when the panic started. The first official evacuation order came too late. By the time the resort manager finally called emergency services, the access road was already underwater. What used to be a smooth stretch of asphalt was now a shimmering river, waves rolling over it like they had been waiting years for permission. Inside Seabreeze Cove, panic spread faster than the water. Guests poured out of their rooms clutching phones, towels, designer handbags, anything they thought mattered in that moment. The lobby, once filled with soft piano music and champagne glasses, echoed with shouting and alarms. I stood across the inlet on higher ground, watching it all unfold. The tide wasn't violent. It was patient. A snap. One of the concrete pylons shifted just a few inches, but that was enough. The glass front balconies above it trembled, then shattered in sequence, like dominoes falling in slow motion. People screamed as shards of glass rained into the dark water below. Emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in red. That's when the reality finally hit them. This place wasn't sinking because of a storm. It was sinking because it was never supposed to exist. Martin Kessler arrived in a soaked suit, screaming into his phone. "This is impossible," he kept saying. The engineers said. The engineers were already gone. So were the investors. The HOA board members huddled together near the front desk, shoes off, pants rolled up, staring at water creeping across imported marble floors. One woman whispered, "Can't we sue the ocean?" No one laughed this time. The tidal flats were no longer hidden. They had returned. Mud surged up through cracks in the flooring. Seagrass floated inside the lobby. Tiny crabs, displaced but alive, clung to overturned furniture as if confused about how they ended up inside a luxury resort. This wasn't destruction. It was restoration. The land was reclaiming its shape. Fire crews tried to reach the site by boat, but even they struggled. The tide moved unpredictably around the artificial foundations, creating whirlpools where there had never been any before. A rescue worker shouted, "This whole base is unstable." Guests were ferried out one by one. Some cried. Some filmed. Some demanded refunds as if customer service could negotiate with the moon. By the time the sun began to rise, Seabreeze Cove was half submerged. And still sinking. Daylight revealed the truth they had tried to bury. The entire resort leaned slightly toward the sea, like a drunk trying to stay upright. Sections of the boardwalk were gone. The parking garage had collapsed inward, swallowed by mud and water. News helicopters circled overhead. Environmental experts didn't look surprised. They looked angry. It didn't take long for the documents to surface. Emails showing ignored warnings. Permits approved under special conditions. Environmental impact reports rewritten and watered down. The HOA had paid fines and called it compliance. Nature doesn't accept fines. Within a week, the lawsuits began. Homeowners sued the HOA. Investors sued the developers. Guests sued everyone. Martin Kessler resigned for personal reasons and disappeared from public view. Seabreeze Cove was declared unsafe. Entry forbidden. Demolition planned, but never completed. There was nothing stable left to demolish. 3 months later, another king tide arrived. This time, no one was there to panic. The remaining structures finally gave in. Walls collapsed. The last standing tower folded into the sea like wet cardboard. By morning, Seabreeze Cove was gone. In its place, tidal flats. Exactly where they had always been. People still ask me if I feel satisfied. I don't. I feel relieved. Because the ocean didn't act out of anger. It acted out of memory. And it remembered every inch of land that was never for sale. The ocean moved on. People didn't. For months after Seabreeze Cove vanished, cars still pulled over along the coastal road. Tourists stood staring at the empty horizon, trying to match glossy online photos with the reality in front of them. There was nothing left to see.
No resort. No ruins.
No trace that millions of dollars had ever existed there. Just mud, water, and birds returning like they'd never left. State investigators arrived first. Then federal environmental agencies. Then lawyers. So many lawyers that the local cafe started offering discounts for legal professionals in town for the Seabreeze case. The findings were worse than anyone expected. Environmental impact studies altered after submission flood risk models intentionally downplayed engineers pressured to optimize language. Internal HOA emails mocking environmental concerns. One message from Martin Kessler stood out. The tide charts are exaggerated. Worst case, we reinforce later. Later never came. What started as civil lawsuits became criminal inquiries. The question wasn't if rules were broken. It was how many. Prosecutors focused on one core issue. They knowingly built on land that legally belonged to the sea. That changed everything. Insurance companies refused payouts. Coverage clauses excluded predictable natural reclamation. Investors lost everything. And suddenly, the HOA's confidence vanished. The cruelest part? Most homeowners had nothing to do with the decision. HOA fees skyrocketed to cover legal defense. Property values across the entire community collapsed. Families who had saved for decades found themselves trapped in homes worth half of what they paid. For sale signs lined the streets. No buyers came. One woman told a reporter, "We trusted them. They said it was safe." Trust doesn't hold back tides. 6 months later, Martin appeared in court. He looked smaller, thinner.
No tailored suites. No confident smile.
Under oath, he tried to shift blame to engineers, consultants, even climate models. The judge wasn't impressed. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "the ocean doesn't need your permission." That quote made national headlines. By the next year, the tidal flats had fully recovered. Sea grass returned thicker than before. Fish nurseries reappeared. Bird populations doubled. Scientists called it one of the fastest coastal restorations on record. All without human help. Especially without human interference. Students came to study the site. Documentaries were filmed. Seabreeze Cove became a cautionary tale taught in environmental law classes. The land didn't remember the resort. It remembered itself. Bankrupt. Discredited. Disbanded. The HOA officially dissolved 18 months after the disaster. Its remaining assets, mostly office furniture and legal debt, were auctioned off. No memorial.
No apology plaque.
No admission of guilt. Just silence. I still walk the flats at low tide. Sometimes I find fragments, polished stone, bits of tile, a rusted screw. The sea gives them back occasionally, as if to remind us what happens when we forget our place. I leave them where they are. They belong to the tide now. People say this was a tragedy. It wasn't. It was a correction. The tragedy would have been pretending the land could be owned, sold, and silenced forever. Nature is patient, but it keeps receipts. The internet discovered Seabreeze Cove before the courts finished with it. At first, it was just drone footage. Aerial shots comparing the before, a glittering luxury resort with infinity pools and palm-lined walkways, to the after, a flat, breathing stretch of mud and water where nothing artificial remained. The captions were brutal. Nature didn't demolish it. Nature deleted it. Within days, the footage was everywhere. TikTok clips hit millions of views. YouTube documentaries trended globally. Reddit threads dissected every HOA email leak line by line. People weren't just angry. They were satisfied. For years, coastal communities had warned about reckless development. Seabreeze Cove became proof that the warnings weren't dramatic. They were precise. Memes followed. HOA versus the moon, luxury resort, economy foundation, built on vibes and greed, but beneath the humor was something sharper. Validation. Major news networks ran special segments. Environmental scientists were invited on air, not to speculate, but to explain how predictable the disaster had been. One expert said, "This wasn't climate change uncertainty. This was basic tidal science ignored for profit." Another called it the most expensive example of arrogance in modern coastal development. Martin Kessler's old interviews resurfaced. His confident dismissals were replayed side by side with footage of water pouring through the resort lobby. The contrast was unforgiving. A streaming service picked it up next. A 3-part documentary series. Episode 1. The Promise Episode 2. The Warning Episode 3. The Reclamation. They interviewed residents, scientists, former contractors, even a junior engineer who had quit after being told to stop sounding like an activist. That engineer cried on camera. "I knew it would fail," he said. "I just didn't know it would fail that completely." Lawmakers noticed. Not out of wisdom, out of fear. Coastal states rushed emergency bills through committees. Stricter tidal zone construction bans, mandatory third-party environmental reviews, criminal liability for falsified impact reports. HOA board accountability laws. Seabreeze Cove was cited by name in legislative debates. "No one wants to be the next headline," one senator admitted. Developers pushed back. Voters didn't care. A new phrase entered public vocabulary, pulling a sea breeze. It meant ignoring environmental reality until nature humiliates you publicly. Even real estate firms started using it internally as a warning. That's when you know a lesson landed. Some investors rebuilt their lives. Others didn't. One couple lost retirement savings they'd invested after an HOA presentation promised guaranteed coastal appreciation. They sold their house and moved inland. I still love the ocean, the husband said. I just respect it now. Martin Kessler never gave another interview. He tried consulting under a different company name. Someone always recognized him. 5 years later, the tidal flats are officially designated a permanent conservation zone. No development.
No exceptions. No negotiations.
Children visit on school trips. Scientists monitor biodiversity. Birds nest where penthouses once stood. At low tide, you can still see faint outlines, where pylons disturb the sediment. At high tide, even those disappear, as if the land is saying, lesson acknowledged, balance restored. People think the ocean punished arrogance. That's not true. The ocean simply continued doing what it always had. It was humans who forgot. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges. Anger fades. Headlines disappear. Names lose meaning. But the land remembers. It's been years since Seabreeze Cove vanished, and yet people still ask me about it. They expect drama. They expect bitterness. They expect celebration. What they don't expect is quiet, because that's what remains. Quiet water, soft mud, wind moving through seagrass. The kind of quiet that existed long before blueprints and board meetings. If you could go back, someone once asked me, would you stop them? I thought about it for a long time, not because I didn't try, but because stopping them would have required something humans rarely accept: limits. They didn't need better engineering. They didn't need stronger concrete. They didn't need smarter lawyers. They needed humility. The HOA believed ownership meant control, that a deed, a permit, and enough money could turn a living system into a product. But tidal land doesn't belong to people. It belongs to motion, to cycles older than language, to the pull of the moon, to time measured in centuries, not quarterly returns. You can interrupt that. You just can't replace it. The ocean didn't rage. It didn't strike out of spite. It waited. It waited for the tide that was already scheduled, for the moon that had always pulled it higher, for the moment humans forgot to listen. And when that moment came, it simply arrived. As promised. There were no villains dragged away in handcuffs.
No dramatic confessions.
No single moment where everything felt resolved. Instead, there was something rarer. Correction. The land returned to what it was. The laws changed. The arrogance lost value. And future projects, quietly, without ceremony, were never approved. That's how real consequences work. Sometimes, at very low tide, I walk out to where the main lobby once stood. I know exactly where it was. Not because anything is visible, but because I remember where the birds stopped landing during construction. Now they're back. I stand there, ankle deep in mud, water slowly returning, and I think about how temporary certainty really is. How fragile luxury becomes when it forgets context. How strong nature is when left alone. If there's one thing Seabreeze Cove taught us, it's this. You don't have to fight nature to lose. You just have to ignore it. Nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't care how convincing your presentation was. It only keeps going. The HOA built a luxury resort on my tidal flats. The ocean didn't destroy it. The ocean simply remembered where it belonged. And one night, under a full moon, it took its place back.